November 14, 1919. Hartwell Industrial Complex, 47 miles northwest of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. 4:47 a.m. Thomas Brennan, night supervisor at the Pennsylvania State Labor Commission, couldn't have known that the locked door he was forcing open would reveal what federal investigators would later call the most systematic dehumanization ever documented on American soil. Behind him, the Allegheny River wound through valleys choked with coal smoke and factory exhaust. Ahead, in the subterranean levels of what had been proudly called America's arsenal of standardization, lay evidence of 34 months of methodical horror that had consumed at least 186 men, though the final count would prove impossible to verify. Between Brennan's arrival and the discovery that would follow at dawn, stretched a silence that had lasted since August 1917, when the first workers entered Hartwell's experimental production facilities and never emerged the same. The Hartwell Industrial Complex occupied 340 acres of Pennsylvania wilderness, carved from forest land in the spring of 1916 when America's entry into the Great War seemed inevitable. The site was chosen with calculated precision, remote enough to avoid scrutiny, close enough to Pittsburgh's steel mills to seem legitimate, positioned along the Allegheny for transportation but isolated by the river's bend and surrounding ridges that turned the valley into a natural acoustic dead zone. Colonel Edmund Hartwell, British Army Corps of Engineers, had toured American factories in 1915 on behalf of His Majesty's War Office. What he witnessed disgusted him. American production, he wrote in reports now archived at the Imperial War Museum, was chaotic, individualistic, wasteful of human potential and mechanical efficiency alike. Workers arrived at different times, worked at varying paces, took irregular breaks, displayed personality in their methods. The American laborer, Hartwell wrote in March 1916, retains too much autonomy. He thinks. Thinking slows production. The ideal worker is an organic component, standardized, predictable, interchangeable. When America declared war in April 1917, Hartwell saw opportunity. The British government, desperate for American manufacturing capacity, granted him extraordinary authority. The U.S. War Department, eager to prove industrial competence to skeptical British allies, gave him carte blanche. The Pennsylvania state government, blinded by promises of jobs and federal contracts, asked no questions. Hartwell recruited Dr. Frederick Marsh, previously dismissed from Johns Hopkins University Medical School for ethical irregularities involving patient consent. Together, they recruited Nathan Voss, an efficiency engineer who had worked under Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, and had taken Taylor's principles to conclusions even Taylor had considered extreme. The three men shared a vision: workers transformed into living machinery through conditioning, deprivation, and what they termed behavioral standardization protocols. The factory would produce not just munitions and vehicles, but a new type of human, one stripped of individual variation, optimized for repetitive function, as identical as the parts they assembled. They advertised for workers in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Baltimore newspapers throughout spring and summer 1917. The appeals targeted specific demographics: unemployed immigrants with limited English, men with no local family connections, drifters seeking fresh starts, veterans invalid out of service. The pay was exceptional: $4 per day, nearly double standard factory wages. Room and board included. Transportation provided. 6-month contracts, with bonuses for completion. What the advertisements didn't mention: workers would be confined to the complex for the contract's duration. No visitors. No mail out, only heavily censored mail in. No telephone access. Security protocols for war production, the contracts explained in fine print. Standard practice, they were told. Patriotic necessity. The first cohort, 83 men, arrived June 18, 1917. They were processed through what appeared to be a standard medical examination. Height, weight, dental inspection, vision test, cardiovascular assessment. Dr. Marsh measured skull dimensions, cranial capacity, arm length, stride pattern. He photographed each man from 6 angles, front lit with harsh precision that erased shadow and individuality, making faces look like inventory items. They were assigned numbers, not supplementary to names, replacing them. Worker 001 through Worker 083. Their clothing was collected for standardization purposes. They received identical gray cotton uniforms, identical boots, 3 sizes only, small, medium, large, identical caps. Personal possessions were stored for safekeeping. They would be returned, they were assured, at contract completion. The dormitories appeared Spartan but acceptable. Rows of identical iron frame beds, identically spaced. Identical footlockers. Identical tin cups hanging from identical hooks. The sameness was attributed to military efficiency. What seemed odd, but not immediately alarming, the windows were barred. Explained as theft prevention. The dormitory doors locked from outside. Fire safety, they were told, prevent panic rushes. The complete absence of mirrors anywhere in the facility. Unnecessary distraction from work. The factory floor stretched 400 feet, a cathedral of industrial production. Assembly lines for vehicle chassis, munitions casings, engine components. The machinery was state-of-art, imported from Ford's Highland Park plant. But the organization of work was something new, something that would have disturbed even Ford's efficiency experts. Each worker was assigned to a single, repetitive motion. Not a task, a motion. Worker 027 would lift a component 2.3 pounds in weight, rotate it 90 degrees clockwise, place it in a fixture. Nothing else. 8 hours per day, 6 days per week. Worker 041 would tighten 4 bolts, always the same 4 bolts, in the same sequence, with the same number of turns. Worker 056 would inspect a weld seam for 4.2 seconds, timed exactly, then stamp or reject. The pace was controlled by mechanical belt speed, which increased weekly. Gradual adaptation to optimal efficiency, Voss explained to British observers who toured the facility in September 1917. We're proving human capacity exceeds assumed limitations. What the observers didn't see, the conditioning protocols implemented in dormitories. The gradual reduction of sleep, from 8 hours to 7 to 6 to 5. The nutritional restrictions, caloric intake calculated to maintain work capacity while inducing docility. The isolation from all variables, no newspapers, no weather reports, no calendars, no clocks visible to workers. Days blurred into identical units of wake, work, eat, sleep. And they didn't see the adjustment rooms. Not every worker adapted smoothly to standardization. Some retained what Hartwell called individual variability. They worked too slowly, too quickly, asked questions, showed emotion, made mistakes. These workers required adjustment. The adjustment rooms occupied the sub-basement level, accessed by stairs behind the medical office. They were discovered empty in November 1919, but worker testimony, fragmented, traumatic, delivered through tears and shaking, painted horrific pictures later. Small rooms, 8 feet by 8 feet, completely dark. Workers who deviated from standard were confined there, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. They could hear machinery through the walls, the same rhythmic sounds as the factory floor, never stopping. They were fed at irregular intervals through a slot, preventing temporal orientation. Dr. Marsh visited periodically to administer corrective conditioning. Methods detailed in his journals would later make even hardened federal investigators physically ill. When workers emerged, they were different. Quieter. More compliant. Their movements more mechanical, their faces more blank. One supervisor, testifying later, described them as emptied out, like somebody scooped the person away and left a machine running in person shape. But some didn't emerge at all. Worker 023, civilian name Robert Finch, 34 years old, Baltimore, Maryland, had been a carpenter before the war. Skilled hands, quick mind, 3 children waiting at home. His wife Sarah received censored letters monthly through August 1917, then nothing. She wrote to the Hartwell complex. Her letters went unanswered. Worker 068, James McAllister, 41, Philadelphia, had survived the Somme but left the army with a limp that barred him from returning to combat. He wanted to contribute to the war effort anyway. His sister Margaret received 2 letters describing the work as strange but well paid, then silence. She contacted the War Department. They assured her everything was proper. Worker 051, Antonio Bernardi, 28, New York City, Italian immigrant, had saved money to bring his parents from Sicily. He needed 6 months of excellent wages. His cousin received 1 letter, "The work is hard, but I am saving. Something is wrong here. If you don't hear from me again." The letter ended there. Incomplete. The cousin assumed Antonio had been interrupted. He hadn't. Dr. Marsh had confiscated it during mail inspection. Antonio's name appeared on no subsequent documents. By November 1917, 6 months after the first cohort's arrival, 0 workers had completed contracts. None had left the facility. This should have raised alarms. It didn't. Hartwell informed inquiring families that contracts had been voluntarily extended, additional bonuses offered, additional service to the war effort. The War Department, consumed with mobilizing millions of soldiers, never audited Hartwell's labor retention rates. A second cohort of 71 workers arrived December 1917. A third cohort of 93 arrived March 1918. They joined a facility that now housed the original 83, though how many of those 83 remained recognizably human was a question nobody in authority was asking. The armistice of November 11, 1918, should have ended everything. The war was over. Contracts could be completed, workers released, the facility decommissioned. Instead, Hartwell argued for continuation. "We've perfected methods applicable to peacetime production," he wrote to the War Department. "Automotive manufacturing, agricultural equipment, any mass production benefits from our protocols. We request authorization to continue research." Authorization was granted. The facility operated through winter and spring of 1919. Workers continued to not leave. Families continued to receive vague reassurances. And in the sub-basements, the adjustment rooms continued their dark work, perfecting the transformation of men into standardized components of an industrial machine that had long since exceeded any legitimate purpose. It would take an accountant's curiosity about discrepancies in death benefit claims to finally crack open the silence that had festered for 34 months in the Pennsylvania wilderness. March 1919. Pennsylvania State Labor Commission, Pittsburgh, 2:15 p.m. Thomas Brennan had spent 16 years processing workers' compensation claims and death benefits. He had a mind trained to see patterns in numbers, anomalies in data. What he noticed about Hartwell Industrial Complex wasn't dramatic, just odd. Odd enough to bother him through March and April. Odd enough to keep him at his desk past normal hours, pulling files, comparing records, building a case file nobody had requested. The anomaly was simple: 0 claims. Hartwell employed, according to payroll records, between 200 and 250 workers at any given time over 34 months of operation. They performed heavy industrial work with dangerous machinery. Pennsylvania factories of similar size averaged 12 to 18 injury claims monthly, 2 to 3 death benefits annually. Hartwell had filed 0 claims. 0 injuries reported. 0 fatalities. Either Hartwell had achieved impossibly perfect safety, or something was preventing claims from being filed. Brennan was 42 years old, veteran of the Spanish-American War, survivor of yellow fever in Cuba that left him with a limp and chronic pain that made him intimately familiar with bureaucracy's indifference to suffering. He had learned that institutions protected themselves first, truth distant second. He had learned that remarkable claims required remarkable evidence. He began with payroll records. The War Department required contractors to submit quarterly labor reports, names, wages, hours. Hartwell submitted them punctually. Brennan obtained copies through his office's routine filing system, drew no attention to his interest. The names appeared normal. Alphabetical lists, 200+ names per quarter. But when Brennan compared lists across quarters, he noticed something strange: very little repetition. Each quarter showed almost entirely different names. If Hartwell employed 200 workers in Q2 1917, and 200 different workers in Q3 1917, and 200 different workers in Q4 1917, that meant turnover approaching 100% every 3 months. Either Hartwell had catastrophically bad working conditions driving constant resignations, or workers weren't leaving through normal channels. Brennan cross-referenced names with other state records. Death certificates, marriage licenses, property transfers, anything indicating continued existence in Pennsylvania. He found some matches, men who had left Hartwell appearing in other records, alive and employed elsewhere. But the majority vanished after their names disappeared from Hartwell's payroll. No death certificates. No new employment records. No forwarding addresses with the post office. It was as if they'd been erased. April 23, 1919. Brennan's office. Evening. Brennan received a visitor he hadn't expected, Margaret McAllister, sister of Worker 068, James McAllister. She'd tracked Brennan down through persistent inquiries at the Labor Commission, demanding to know why nobody could tell her what happened to her brother. "He went to that factory in June of 17, she said, hands clutching a folder of letters. "He was supposed to work 6 months. It's been nearly 2 years. The War Department tells me he extended his contract. The factory tells me he's no longer employed there. But nobody can tell me where he went." She spread letters across Brennan's desk. 2 from James, dated July and August 1917. Standard content: work is hard, pay is good, I'm saving money. Nothing alarming except their abrupt cessation. "I wrote to 15 men, Margaret said. Names from the newspapers, other families who had men working at Hartwell. I found 11 who would respond. Every single one, the same story. Letters for 2, maybe 3 months. Then nothing. The families are told their men extended contracts, or their men left for employment elsewhere, or their men simply stopped writing. But nobody knows where they are." Brennan added the names to his growing list. 11 more data points. 11 more families with questions nobody would answer. "Mr. Brennan," Margaret McAllister said, leaning forward with intensity that reminded him of soldiers' widows he'd processed claims for, women who knew, in their bones, that official reports were lies. "Something is wrong at that factory. I can feel it. My brother was a good man. He survived the Western Front. He would not simply disappear without word to his family." Brennan believed her. But belief wasn't evidence, and evidence was what he needed to push institutional machinery into investigation. May 1919. Hartwell Industrial Complex. Brennan drove to Hartwell under pretext of routine labor inspection. He brought no backup, filed no official visit notice, wanted to observe without announcement. The drive took 3 hours through increasingly remote terrain, past Pittsburgh's industrial sprawl, into coal country, then into wilderness that seemed too empty for a major war production facility. The complex appeared from around a ridge like something imported from darker places. High fences topped with barbed wire. Guard towers at corners, unusual for a factory, explained away as protection for valuable war materials. A single guarded entrance with checkpoint procedures more appropriate for a military installation than a civilian workplace. Brennan presented his credentials. The guards, private security, not factory workers, made him wait 30 minutes while they verified his authorization. When finally admitted, he was escorted. Not guided, escorted. A guard remained within 10 feet at all times. Colonel Hartwell met him in an administration building that spoke of military precision. Everything squared, aligned, spotless. Hartwell himself, 58 years old, ramrod posture, eyes that evaluated Brennan the way a machinist might evaluate a questionable component. "Mr. Brennan. Unexpected visit. How may we assist the Labor Commission?" Brennan kept his approach routine. Standard questions about safety procedures, injury reporting protocols, workers' compensation insurance coverage. Hartwell answered with military precision. Safety was paramount. Protocols exceeded federal requirements. Zero injuries reflected superior training and discipline. "Might I tour the facility?" Brennan asked. "Observe operations?" Hartwell's hesitation lasted only a second, but Brennan, trained to notice, caught it. "Certainly. Though much of our work remains classified under War Department authority. We can show you general assembly areas." The factory floor was unlike anything Brennan had seen. He'd toured dozens of factories, steel mills, munitions plants, vehicle assembly facilities. They all had certain chaos to them, human energy and noise and individual variation in how workers moved and interacted. Hartwell's floor was silent except for machinery. Workers moved in perfect synchronization, their actions timed to belt speeds with mechanical precision. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. They stared at their assigned tasks with faces devoid of expression, hands moving in repetitive motions that seemed almost automated. Brennan tried to catch a worker's eye. Not one looked at him. Not one acknowledged his presence. They worked with the focused intensity of men under terrible supervision, or terrible something else. "Your workers seem very disciplined," Brennan said carefully. "We've perfected training methods," Hartwell replied. "Efficiency through standardization. Each man knows his role, executes it flawlessly. Individual variation is eliminated. Production rates exceed comparable facilities by 40%. Might I speak with some workers? Ask about their experiences." Another hesitation. "Our men are on strict schedules. Breaking concentration reduces efficiency. I'm sure you understand. War production demands focus." "The war ended 6 months ago, Colonel." Hartwell's expression didn't change. Discipline remains essential for any production environment. "Our methods prove that." Brennan noticed other oddities during the brief tour. No windows in the factory floor, artificial lighting only, preventing workers from knowing time of day or weather. No clocks visible to workers, only supervisors carried watches. No break rooms where men might gather and converse. Bathroom breaks were apparently scheduled. He saw no workers leaving assembly lines during his 45-minute observation. And he noticed the guards. Not just at gates, throughout the facility. Men with clubs standing at intervals along the factory floor. Not doing anything, just watching. Their presence seemed less about protecting valuable equipment and more about controlling human behavior. May 17, 1919. Brennan's office. Late evening. Brennan was building a file that troubled him deeply, but couldn't yet prove anything criminal. Strange didn't mean illegal. Unusual didn't mean prosecutable. He needed something concrete: testimony, documentary evidence, a witness willing to break silence. The witness found him. A knock on his office door. Unusual, as the building closed at 6 p.m. and Brennan had stayed late without official authorization. He opened the door cautiously. A man stood there, perhaps 30 years old, rail-thin, eyes sunken with exhaustion or trauma or both. He wore clothes too large for his frame, workers' canvas pants, cotton shirt, both shabby. His hands shook. "You're Brennan?" The one asking questions about Hartwell. "I am." "Who are you?" "Call me Daniel." "That's not my real name. But names are dangerous." "Can I come in?" Brennan let him in, locked the door, closed the blinds. Daniel sat with the careful movements of someone in chronic pain. When he spoke, his voice carried the flat effect of trauma survivors Brennan had processed claims for, men who'd seen things that emptied them out. I worked at Hartwell. Worker 127. Arrived December 17. Contract was 6 months. I was there 17 months. I escaped 2 weeks ago. I've been hiding since, waiting until I felt strong enough to find someone who might listen. Tell me everything. What Daniel described over the next 2 hours corroborated Brennan's worst suspicions and added details far worse than he'd imagined. The gradual conditioning, sleep deprivation, nutritional restriction, isolation from any external reference points. The reduction of workers to numbers, the elimination of individual identity. The escalating pace of work that pushed men past sustainable limits. And the adjustment rooms. If you couldn't keep pace, if you showed emotion, if you asked questions, they took you below. Sometimes for hours. Sometimes days. You'd hear screaming through the walls sometimes, but mostly just the machinery sounds, endless and overwhelming. When men came back up, they were different. Emptied out. Like somebody had scooped away the parts that made them human and left just the parts that could work. How many men? Brennan asked. How many were adjusted? I don't know. Dozens, probably. But some didn't come back. We'd notice numbers missing. Nobody explained. We learned not to ask. Asking meant you'd be next. How did you escape? I didn't. I was in the adjustment room. 3rd time. I knew if I stayed I'd become like the others, or I'd die. When they brought food, I attacked the guard, took his keys, ran. I knew the fence patterns, guard rotations. I'd been watching for months, looking for any chance. I made it to the river, followed it. South for 2 days before I felt safe enough to stop. Daniel pulled up his sleeves. Burn marks on his forearms, distinctive patterns, deliberate. They did this. Called it conditioning. Pain association with non-standard behavior. Dr. Marsh supervised. He took notes while they burned us. Brennan felt cold certainty settling in his chest. This wasn't just labor exploitation. This was systematic torture disguised as industrial efficiency. This was a horror that had operated for nearly 2 years under official sanction, protected by wartime secrecy and bureaucratic indifference. Will you testify? Give a formal statement. Daniel's eyes showed fear, but also determination. If it stops them. If it helps the others still in there. Yes. I'll testify. But you need to move fast. They rotate workers through. Men still alive now might not be in a month. And they're destroying evidence. I saw them burning records before I escaped. June-September 1919. Bureaucratic labyrinth. Brennan spent 3 months navigating official resistance to investigation. The War Department insisted Hartwell operated under federal authority, beyond state jurisdiction. The Department of Labor said war contractors weren't their responsibility during wartime operations, and technically, though the armistice had been signed, the war hadn't been officially concluded by treaty yet. Local Pennsylvania authorities deferred to federal authorities. Federal authorities deferred to military authorities. Military authorities insisted everything at Hartwell was proper and classified. Brennan escalated to his supervisor, who escalated to the state labor commissioner, who escalated to the governor's office. Each level added delay, asked for more documentation, expressed skepticism that a British officer operating under War Department authority could be engaged in criminal activity. Meanwhile, Brennan collected more evidence. He found 3 more escapees, men who'd fled Hartwell at different times and been too traumatized or afraid to report what they'd experienced. Each told similar stories. Each bore physical scars. Each could name other workers who'd disappeared. Brennan compiled a formal report, suspected labor rights violations and possible criminal activity at Hartwell Industrial Complex. 63 pages. Names of 47 workers confirmed missing. Medical documentation of injuries from 4 escapees. Testimony from 11 families. Financial anomalies in Hartwell's reporting. The governor's office finally authorized investigation. But they insisted on proper coordination with federal authorities. More delays, more bureaucracy, more weeks passing while men remained trapped in that Pennsylvania valley. It was Daniel who finally broke the deadlock. September 8, 1919. St. Mary's Hospital, Pittsburgh. Daniel collapsed on a Pittsburgh street, malnourished and suffering from injuries that had never properly healed. Hospital staff treating him notified police about suspicious burn patterns and signs of prolonged confinement. A detective interviewed him. Daniel, delirious with fever, told everything. The detective, skeptical but disturbed, contacted Brennan. By the time Brennan reached the hospital, Daniel was dying. Infections from untreated injuries, malnutrition, damage to organs. His body simply giving out after months of systematic abuse followed by weeks of desperate survival. But Daniel had one more thing to give. Before escaping, he'd stolen something from Dr. Marsh's office, risked additional torture to grab a small leather-bound notebook he'd seen Marsh writing in constantly. He'd hidden it in the wilderness during his flight, retrieved it after escaping, kept it concealed since. "My brother's jacket," Daniel whispered, gesturing weakly toward the belongings hospital staff had collected. "Inside lining. I sewed it in. Take it. It's proof." He documented everything. Every adjustment. Every protocol. Daniel died at 3:17 a.m. on September 9, 1919. His civilian name was Daniel Patrick Whalen, 31 years old, Boston, Massachusetts. He had a wife and daughter who'd been told he'd abandoned them. His daughter was 3 years old. She would grow up never knowing her father had died a hero, trying to save men he'd suffered alongside. Brennan found the notebook sewn into the jacket's lining, just as Daniel had said. 50 pages of tight handwriting in Dr. Frederick Marsh's clinical script. Each page a catalogue of horror presented as scientific data. Adjustment protocols detailed with the detachment of entomology research. Pain thresholds measured and recorded. Behavioral conditioning methods refined through systematic experimentation on human subjects. And in the back pages, a list. Worker numbers. Dates. Status updates. Worker 023, deceased November 14, 17, cardiac failure during conditioning. Worker 041, deceased December 3, 17, did not survive adjustment protocol. Worker 068, deceased January 22, 18, expired during extended isolation. Worker 051, deceased October 9, 17, conditioning complications. 28 entries marked deceased. More marked as successfully adjusted or ongoing conditioning, or simply removed from rotation. Brennan had his proof. Documented torture. Documented deaths. Written in the perpetrator's own hand. It was enough to force federal action, enough to overcome bureaucratic resistance, enough to finally break open the silence that had protected Hartwell Industrial Complex for 34 months. September 15 to October 8, 1919. Federal mobilization. The governor of Pennsylvania, presented with Marsh's notebook, authorized immediate state action. The U.S. Attorney General, informed of British military personnel potentially committing crimes on American soil, authorized federal investigation. The War Department, suddenly desperate to distance itself from potential scandal, revoked Hartwell's authority and ordered the facility sealed. But Hartwell, receiving warning through military channels that investigation was imminent, initiated what he called final protocols. On September 28, all remaining workers were confined to dormitories. No explanation provided. Food delivered through locked doors. Guards doubled. The factory floor went silent for the first time in 34 months. No production, no work, just waiting. Hartwell, Marsh, and Voss spent the week systematically destroying evidence. Files burned in furnaces designed for industrial waste. Records shredded, ashes scattered. Equipment in the adjustment rooms dismantled, components dispersed. They worked with military precision, eliminating documentation of 34 months of systematic horror. What they couldn't eliminate, the workers themselves. 147 men remained in Hartwell on October 1, 1919. Some had been there since 1917. All bore physical and psychological scars of conditioning protocols. All were witnesses. The British officer and his colleagues faced a choice: surrender and face prosecution, or eliminate evidence completely. Hartwell chose a third option. On October 6, 2 days before federal marshals were scheduled to arrive with arrest warrants, Hartwell gathered his staff in the administration building. He distributed service revolvers to senior supervisors. He gave a speech about duty, about sacrifice, about the certainty that their work, though misunderstood, had been righteous and necessary. That evening, workers in the dormitories heard gunshots. Multiple weapons, rapid fire, coming from the direction of the administration building. Then silence. When federal marshals arrived on October 8, 1919, accompanied by Thomas Brennan and a medical team, they found Hartwell Industrial Complex deserted of leadership. The gates stood open. The dormitories were locked but unguarded. Workers inside, hearing the locks opening for the first time in months or years, emerged blinking into October sunlight. Some confused, some terrified, some unable to process that their confinement had ended. In the administration building, marshals found 7 bodies. Colonel Edmund Hartwell, bullet through his own skull, service revolver in his hand, seated at his desk with military straightness even in death. Dr. Frederick Marsh, similarly deceased, slumped over medical journals in his office. Nathan Voss and 4 senior supervisors, all dead by gunshot, all weapons accounted for. Suicide rather than prosecution. Eliminating themselves as witnesses. Leaving behind only fragmentary evidence and traumatized victims whose testimony would be dismissed by many as exaggeration or fabrication. But they'd missed something. In their hurried destruction of evidence, they'd forgotten about the sub-basements. October 8, 1919. Hartwell Industrial Complex. 7:30 a.m. The workers who emerged from the dormitories were not men anymore. Thomas Brennan watched them file into October light, moving in lockstep, unable to break assembly line rhythm even without machinery. They didn't speak. They didn't make eye contact. They stared at nothing with expressions of profound emptiness. Dr. Sarah Henderson began examinations. Every worker bore marks, burn patterns on forearms, scars from restraints, severe malnutrition. But psychological damage was worse. These men respond to commands but can't make decisions, she noted. Several forgot their own names. Their personalities have been erased. Worker 127 space stood empty. Daniel Patrick Whalen, whose stolen notebook enabled the raid. His possessions remained: a photograph of his wife and daughter, letters never mailed. One read, "My dearest Mary, they are changing us, making us forget ourselves. I try to hold your face, but it gets harder." The letter ended incomplete. 11 a.m. The sub-basements. Federal Marshal Doherty found stairs behind the medical office. Brennan joined the first descent, 30 feet into limestone bedrock. At the bottom, a corridor with metal doors at intervals. The first door, an adjustment room. 8 by 8 feet. When closed, darkness was absolute, disorienting within seconds. Hooks for restraints. Drain in floor. Scratch marks on walls. Fingernails scraping stone in desperation. 7 adjustment rooms. All identical. Standardized torture chambers. The corridor extended deeper. Storerooms with restraints, chains, leather straps, all precisely organized. Equipment rooms with electroshock apparatus, hydrotherapy devices modified for pain, pharmaceutical supplies. "This is a complete conditioning laboratory," Dr. Henderson said. "Professional design. This took official approval." They found Marsh's underground office. Filing cabinets full of medical records. Worker 041, day 47. Resistance remains high. Recommend escalated isolation with drugs. Worker 068, day 112. Personality successfully suppressed. Individual variation eliminated. Worker 127, day 89. Attempted theft. May not survive full protocol. Hundreds of pages documenting torture as scientific progress. A third level descended further into limestone. 3 chambers with evidence of long-term confinement. And bones. Dr. Henderson examined them, hands shaking. Human. Male. Dead at least a year. Blunt force trauma. This man was killed. They found the incinerator, industrial model for reducing remains to ash. The ash pit contained dental work, bone fragments, metal that might have been wedding rings. They burned them like industrial waste, Henderson said. Behind the complex, disturbed earth. Excavation found 17 bodies. All malnourished. Several showed bone changes from chronic restraint. Multiple showed violence, fractures, skull trauma. Worker 023, Robert Finch, identified by his wife through healed fracture. Worker 068, James McAllister, through dental records. Worker 051, Antonio Bernardi, never conclusively identified. 17 bodies. 28 listed deceased in Marsh's notebook. 186 workers total. 147 survivors. At least 39 vanished completely. Survivor testimony. Marcus Webb, worker 183. First week was normal. Then they reduced sleep, drugged our food. If you complained, they took you below. The worst part was forgetting. Your name, your family. Some men forgot completely. Empty eyes. Everything human stripped away. I survived because I held on to anger. Worker 201, monotone. The darkness is total. They played machinery sounds constantly. You'd hallucinate. Begged to be let out. When they opened the door, light was agony. But you'd be grateful to people who tortured you. That's how they broke you. Final discovery. A remote cave contained preservation equipment. And jars. Dozens of jars with human organs in formaldehyde, hearts, brains, nervous tissue. Each labeled with worker numbers. Marsh was harvesting organs post-mortem, Dr. Henderson said, hands shaking. Studying successful conditioning. The cave was sealed. Contents destroyed. Some evidence was too horrific to preserve. Marshall Daugherty testified to Congress. At least 28 confirmed deaths. 39 missing. 147 permanently damaged. This operated with War Department authorization. Complete failure of oversight. We failed these men. That failure must never be forgotten. October 25, 1919. Hartwell burned. The complex was destroyed completely. Fire consumed factory floor, dormitories, administration building. Explosives collapsed subbasements, entombing adjustment rooms in rubble. By evening, nothing remained. Within weeks, the site was graded and seeded. Maps were altered. No markers indicated anything had existed there. The survivors. 147 men emerged alive. None recovered. Most couldn't maintain employment, conditioned to respond only to external control. Marcus Webb lasted 3 days as a machinist before panic attacks forced him into solitary night watchman work. He lived 42 more years but never recovered his personality. Worker 201 was institutionalized within 6 months, catatonic. He died in 1924, age 37, from being broken beyond repair. 17 survivors died within 5 years, suicides, accidents, self-neglect. 23 were permanently institutionalized. Only 3 lived to see 1950. The last died in 1957, 38 years in a halfway house, never able to articulate what had been done. Reforms. The Federal Report, released January 1920, documented the horror and mandated reforms. Federal oversight of contractors. Independent inspections. Right to uncensored communication. Prohibition on confinement-based employment. Strengthened workers' compensation. Medical ethics boards. Ban on experimentation without consent. Federal jurisdiction over labor violations. But the most significant reform was cultural awareness that efficiency could become monstrosity. Congress appropriated $500,000 for victims, approximately $3,000 each. Inadequate, but official acknowledgement of responsibility. A plaque in Pittsburgh's courthouse, in memory of workers who died at Hartwell Industrial Complex, 1917 to 1919, victims of systematic abuse under guise of progress. May their suffering remind us that efficiency without humanity is monstrosity. The investigator's burdens. Brennan kept Daniel Whalen's photograph on his desk for 23 years and paid for his daughter's education. Marshall Doherty transferred to desk work, unable to work active cases. He died in 1931, journal filled with sketches of sub-basement chambers. Dr. Henderson published landmark research on torture's effects, then left medicine entirely, destroyed by the work. Lessons imperfectly learned. Hartwell changed policies, but its core lesson, that efficiency obsession devours humanity, that unchecked authority enables atrocities, was imperfectly learned. Modern parallels echo in subtler forms. Warehouse workers monitored by the second, call center employees tracked for bathroom breaks, gig workers algorithmically managed. The brutality hasn't repeated, but the impulse persists. Workers viewed as components, not humans. The hollow today. The land remains federal property, protected wilderness area, restricted access. Forest reclaimed it. Local residents avoid it. Stories persist. Machinery sounds where no machinery exists, workers in gray uniforms glimpsed then vanishing. Requests to visit are denied. Official reason. Environmental protection. Real reason. Some ground should remain undisturbed. Final accounting. 34 months. 247 men employed. 28 confirmed deaths. 39 missing. 147 survivors destroyed. 0 perpetrators prosecuted, all died by suicide. Approximately 300 family members damaged. The human cost, immeasurable. The lesson. Hartwell, Marsh, and Voss believed they were advancing science. They documented everything, thinking history would vindicate them. They were wrong. Hartwell proved that efficiency without ethics is evil. That standardization without humanity is torture. That progress without dignity is damnation. It happened because authority had absolute power over vulnerable workers in isolation with no oversight. Because efficiency trumped humanity. Because perpetrators convinced themselves ends justified means. And because people who noticed warning signs accepted official explanations until horror became undeniable. Thomas Brennan's final testimony, 1920. I persisted because the numbers told a story. 0 injuries over 34 months. 0 complaints. That silence was suppression, not efficiency. Hartwell is what happens when you view workers as machinery. But humans aren't machines. We have dignity that cannot be standardized, souls that cannot be optimized. Watch for isolation. Question authority. Demand accountability. Protect the vulnerable. Resist dehumanization. 186 men entered Hartwell seeking work. At least 67 never left alive. 147 emerged broken. all because 3 men decided humans could be forged and discarded like metal. Their suffering must not be forgotten, because forgetting is how it happens again. The site is empty. The maps show nothing. The graves are scattered. But somewhere in Pennsylvania wilderness, the earth remembers what happens when efficiency becomes obsession, when progress devours humanity. The Hartwell Industrial Complex is gone. The lesson remains. Remember them. Remember what was done. And remain vigilant that it never happens again.